Now, a few words generally about the concept, and then I will show you my example. That will be followed by about 8 or 9 or 10 other examples. We are fortunate to have practitioners, or at least scholars and teachers in a range of disciplines who, as it happens, already have this concept in mind. And what they will do is, what I hope to do is explain why it's better, why it produces better learning, deeper learning, sustainable learning than how assessment conventionally takes place across the disciplines. I've heard from across the disciplines over the years in a variety, here at our university, in a variety of settings and conferences and whatnot, and amongst my colleagues in law. So hopefully you will be able to get a taste of that, a sense of it, and why this method has been adopted by so many colleagues. I would begin by reminding you that for students, and this is really all about the students, their learning habits are to a large degree driven by how they will be assessed. And this is natural, this is normal, and this should not be derided by teachers who complain about students who are exam-oriented or assessment-oriented. Consider your own experience when you were a student. Ask yourself, what motivated you? One of the first things you tried to find out is, how would I be assessed? What's in this course? What do we have to do? And of course, students will then organize themselves around that to ensure that they can be successful. So assessment is vital, no matter what form it takes. If it takes the wrong form, but by that I mean, if it is designed such that it doesn't tease out sustainable learning practices, deep learning practices, if it doesn't do that, then of course they will still get A's and B's in your course. No question. You're going to give A's and B's anyway. But it will be according to that particular model to succeed by regurgitating or by writing a quick essay on something or other, as opposed to doing something that actually will have relevance for that person, will allow that student to make connections in the world around them between their doctrinal learning and the world around them. So this is part of the concept. So I just want to emphasize, remember the importance of assessment in the student learning experience. It's vital. In my argument, course design should begin with assessment, not end with it. Okay, so having said all that, maybe we'll go to the next slide there. These slides will be available. I'm on a tight time frame, as you know. This is just an attempt to characterize some of the features of authentic assessment, of what it entails. It can take many forms. It usually involves students working independently, discovering, identifying, against the backdrop of the doctrine that they've been studying and learning in the classroom and in their readings. It doesn't sacrifice deep or intellectual rigor. You'll see my last bullet point there, which is perhaps the most important, is that it doesn't sacrifice that. It shouldn't. But nonetheless, it requires that, but it requires the making of connections between that, but your doctrinal learning and real-world applications. And not just for the sake of getting a job, but so that you can make the connection, you can start to think in a way that will help nurture this disposition for lifelong learning. And once you start to make the connections as a student, then you make more connections. You get the habit of doing so, as opposed to reading hard and studying hard to do well on the exam. So this is really against the idea of an exam-oriented learning methodology. Around the university, around all universities, you still see that model prevailing. So I won't say much more about that, but I believe that many of the examples today, will involve a lot of those characteristics. So then, briefly, some advantages. I've sort of tried to sing the praises of them already, but I feel that they do help students beyond the course. For many students, you'll hear a refrain, yeah, I forgot everything a couple of weeks later. Or they got a job, and then they say, yeah, it's not like, gosh, it's nothing like this, and my education doesn't have much connection or much relevance to what I'm doing now. It's really different. You wouldn't believe it. Not to say that your learning should just be about getting a job or becoming good at the job. It should be much more than that. But if students know that what they're learning, if they're asked to make connections with the real world, then they will be able to do that in the future. So they'll be motivated knowing that this has relevance. It can be done without sacrificing any intellectual rigor. So then, Andrea, the next slide says, okay, so now I'm going to just transition into my own presentation. And there's a timekeeper here who will keep me, you can keep me informed. So my example is from law, because I'm a law professor. And the context is tort law, which is a large class of 250 students. It has varied, been as large as 450 when we had the double cohort. It's usually around 250 to 280 students. So it's a large class. If you do a lecture and a method of teaching, you can imagine you need a venue that's very large and students are sitting like you are here, but on a much larger scale. I want you to make note of the fact that it is such a large class, because this will show, I hope, in part, that this kind of a redesign or reconceptualizing of your assessment and your learning can take place at scale. Of course, if you have a small class, it's easier to do things, but you can do it even in a large class. It takes a little bit of planning, a little bit of thinking. My problem, and I had a nice, interesting discussion with some of the presenters when we were having coffee this morning, and I was asked, how did this come about? Where did I get this idea? Well, it happened because teaching law students over the course of many years, finding out, meeting them afterwards, a week or two later, as the summer is underway and they're getting jobs and whatnot, and hearing from them that they didn't really remember much about what they had learned, even though they might have got a very good grade in the course. And this, of course, I've heard all my life. Even as a student, this would happen. And that happens in part because the exam is designed in such a way that work, study, etc., is concentrated toward the end. And this is another feature of authentic assessment. It would probably be progressive, and it persists throughout the course. It isn't a one-off. A one-off, you can imagine a one-off assessment is, which we need them, but you can imagine that how they work, for a student. All the energy focused right there on the event and then done, as opposed to the idea of learning beyond that, being equipped to learn beyond that through the assessment. It has to be through the assessment because that's what motivates the students. So the problem I encountered, and my colleague Alice Lee is here today, who teaches also a large cohort of 250 students in all. We'll maybe share her experience later about this, but the students write an examination because I, of course, as in those days, followed the conventional method for teaching and assessing law students, and it involves, of course, the learning is lecture and tutorial, so large room, 250 students with me talking. Now you can change that even in a lecture, so I don't mean to say that that's the only way to do a lecture. I have introduced over the years many ways of getting beyond that, but nonetheless it's a lecture, a large room, and many students feel out of the picture, naturally, and are trying their best to concentrate in that environment, but it's not that good. And why are they there anyway? Because if I just recorded this thing, they could do it online and not have to bother coming in. I mean, there's a lot of questions that are triggered by that. But anyway, I found that they weren't learning very well. Now, what was the way that they were being asked to learn? What we do in law, what they do still largely in law schools, common law schools around the world, is they assess students by way of examination, mainly by way of examination in hall. Now, you can have one or two other little projects, but they shouldn't carry too much weight, according to the institutional leaders, even in Cambridge and Oxford or other places I've heard from, because they should be just writing exams. And in law, the examination consists of hypothetical questions. That is, stories made up by the teacher to, quite often exaggerated stories whereby the protagonists encounter a series of unfortunate incidents, usually. One thing happens after the other in this story, and then the student is asked to analyze and argue, what would be the outcome with reference to the doctrine. Now, I'm not saying that's a total waste of time. It's certainly what my students had to do under my watch for many years until I changed my ways. But one problem with it, and I think if we go to the next slide, some problems with the hypothetical problem. Well, one of them is that it's hypothetical. Who in the future is going to be spending their time answering hypothetical problems? Now, you're going to be answering novel, ill-defined problems, but not hypothetical. They're going to be real. When something happens, you have to have the ability, the skill to adapt and understand how to have a chance at how to solve it. A problem with the hypothetical, and remember, if you're a student in law, your main goal is to do well, to get a good grade in order to get a job. So you work out how you're going to be assessed. You know it's hypotheticals like this. And not only that, you know it's hypotheticals designed by that particular teacher. Because each teacher has their own little quirks, their own little gimmicks, and their own little habits. And this lore, this knowledge or wisdom is shared among students, from senior students to the lower students, who all plan for this. And then they try to pick up tips in the last lecture or two, clues. The teacher, did you notice she kept mentioning this? I'm sure that'll be on. So you can see the sorts of learning skills that this is nurturing in students. Trying to be a mind reader. Well, now, if your students can be mind readers, that's pretty good. I shouldn't criticize that too much, because that would be a very useful skill. But it doesn't really work that way, really. If you're going to try to learn deeply, you want to learn the material deeply, you want to be a master of the doctrine, and you want to be able to use it and have it at your disposal in the future, not as a one-off. Authenticity comes into it in part. I mean, it's a word, you know, it's not a slogan, but we can certainly change the words. It's in the scholarship. It's been there for a little while. The idea is to get away from what I just described as the artificiality of some university learning and get students doing things, applying. This could involve getting out of the classroom, going downtown, going to some other part of Hong Kong, finding things on their own. It involves discovery. So now on to one of my responses. This is just one of many, but one of my responses was to design something that I call the reflective media diary. Here you can go to the next slide. Actually, now we can show them the instructions. Can I do that? So let me briefly explain. So the reflective media diary is a response to the problem that I've identified of this short-term learning that is of no use to students a few weeks afterwards and had no bearing on the way that the law functions in the real world anyway. What I did was I designed an independent, like task-based assessment whereby students are required to keep a diary, a news diary. They have to keep it as a diary by showing proof that it has been uploaded to a particular website as they read it, and then they analyze it. So they have to read the news in whatever form they want. Usually it's in newspapers, Chinese or English language newspapers in Hong Kong, and identify stories, reports that have something to do with what I am studying in that course, in tort, or in land law, or criminal law, whatever it might be. Or, for that matter, architecture, or business, or medicine. But in any case, or politics, I think Courtney will tell you about. So in any case, so that's what they do. They have to do it on their own. Now, the one important feature of this project is that it has nothing to do with me. I designed you can scroll a little bit slowly. I designed the instructions, and I've fine-tuned them over the course of the first few years just to get the wording right so that there are no more questions raised by students. The project begins the first day of class. So they're coming to study tort law. Already the assessment begins. They can begin diarizing that day. The question arises, how do they know what to diarize? They haven't studied tort law yet. Well, you know, they're students, they're intellectuals, they'll work it out. They start to work it out early on. They have the textbook, they've had one lecture perhaps by then, or one flipped class if it's in the tort law course. They start to work it out, and they start to identify and learn on their own. And they build on this throughout the year. So they have to keep a diary. They have to have up to between 1 and 3 months items diarized each month. It has to be documented and authenticated so that we know that it's kept as a diary. The student has to write a legal analysis more or less on the spot and upload that, continue to build on this. For 6 months this goes on. And at the end of that process, they then submit the package of their best 10 items, and then they are asked to write a deep, let's say, legal memorandum on 2 of them. So 2 of them they must select, the ones that they think are the richest in terms of the legal issues that are contained there, and then they break that down according to the discipline, according to all that they've been learning throughout the year. So let's look at the screenshots. Can we look at the screenshot? So the students are required to find the items. They can find it. When I first introduced this, we used newspapers. and they would photocopy newspapers, but we're far beyond that, so it's all online. And so you can scroll all the way to what the newspapers look like. You see, so here's the first item this student chose for his diary. This was like 1 year ago. Like, you can see the date, it's September. He's only had like one class in tort law, and that's the first item. You can see the date, and it's about the exploding Galaxy Note 7. If we can scroll down a bit further, see other news stories. You can go really fast, Andrea, see what else there is. More. This is the same story. Let's go to the next story. Here we are. Killed trying to help. Horror crash with tow truck leaves 1 dead, causes car pileup. 25th of September. So we're still in the first month of class, and the student is now reading about events and writing about them. Now we'll go to the actual part A, the second one, to look at what the student has been writing. They have a word limit. I don't want them to write forever. They've got other things to do. So here we see now, this is what they wrote on the spot when they read that item. Explain what happened, and then start to explain it legally. Here you have the second paragraph. So there's the next item, killed trying to help. That's about the tow truck driver hit by a lorry when trying to remove an Audi from the highway. So the tow truck driver, they come along when there's a breakdown and they help out. Killed in the process. Now these are rich with legal issues. You wouldn't appreciate that as a non-lawyer, but the students start to appreciate that. It might seem simple. Oh, somebody died on the road. How unfortunate. Yeah, maybe he can sue. There is a multitude of issues there because he's a rescuer. He's out in the public there. What about the one whose vehicle stalled? Why did it stall? What about the one who's driving? There's multiple parties who could be somehow tortiously involved there, and this will complicate the analysis for the court and for the student at that spot. So too the Samsung, the Note 7 thing, but maybe that's a little simpler. Let's look at one more. Family slams hospital over errors. Here we have medical negligence. Maybe let's see what the next one is. Here we are still, now we're in November. Elderly falls through platform gap. Occupiers, already writing about occupiers' liability, which won't be studied until 3 months later. But that student is already providing us an analysis that relates to occupiers' liability, reading ahead, learning, getting the whole picture on his or her own, not without my help. Which is what is going to allow that student to develop the skills. Student identifying issues when they're unmarked, unflagged. In most courses, in most disciplines, right across all the faculties, most of the time, assessments are set, and to some degree, the issues are flagged. You know this test will be on this or that. Or you know next week there will be the subject of whatever will be quizzed or something like that. But do we ever provide students with an opportunity to develop the skill of identifying those issues independently when they're not marked? They're not marked up. These stories, by the way, in the newspaper, do not use the word tort, do not use the word negligence, not at all. You won't find those kinds of words used in these reports. This mimics how it will be in the real world, because when a problem presents itself to a professional, whether a lawyer or otherwise, the one coming and explaining what happened is not likely to use these terms of art or these technical terms or legal terms, but will explain what happened. That's what the newspaper does. So it happens for me to be a rather convenient source. There are other ways of finding authenticity, that is, real things, as opposed to hypothetical things. And the presenters will probably show you that in a variety of different ways today. But for me, I chanced upon this, and it worked quite well. I have other methods, such as photography and video, that students do to try to capture law in the community and analyze it and break it down. But this works well, and it worked well for other disciplines, and some people in this university also use this in other disciplines. So then I think that's all that I need to show you on the screen, and then later you can hear from some students who studied under this method if you're still here. Time is up, and I have to set an example. So over to the next speaker.